6, March 1944. Berlin 25000 feet. B-17 seconds hold in silver boxes, contrails soaring a white seam across a flat grey sky. In a Luftwaffe headset, a clipped order lands front quarter once. The old script: stay high, slash out of the sun, break the box, climb back, wait for the escorts to turn for fuel. They've done this all winter. He feels the stick go heavier as the air thins. Manifold pressure sits at the top of green, RPM steady. Cold oxygen hisses into the mask. The sight ring settles on the lead bomber element. Off his left, an F-Dole 190 drops its nose into the cut. Mental math: one pass, then out beyond the escort edge like every time. But a slim shape slides out of a contrail and does not leave. Deep chin scoop clean wings Mustang. It knifes through, kicks its drop tanks. The wind changes pitch. The RPM needle ticks a half step higher. After the first merge, the American fighter is still there, still climbing, still fast. The 190 ahead jerks sideways. A black thread of smoke snaps into the slipstream like fingers clicking. Fuel state: another voice breaks in and dies. He banks for the empty lane outside escort cover he's counted on for months. There is no empty lane. A pair of P-51 seconds is climbing across his nose. Another pair just slid down the rear quarter. The timing is broken. The pattern is gone. He reaches for the radio switch to call a correction. His hand stops in midair. In the ear cups there is only wind and the steady rasp of oxygen. No order. No reply. Heat crawls up under the mask. Far below a fortress burns a slow orange on the overcast, and the sky inside his helmet goes very quiet. By late winter 1944, the air war over Germany is a narrow window measured in fuel minutes and climb bands, not calendar months. The 8th Air Force has a simple requirement that is hard to meet: keep heavy bombers alive all the way to the target and back often enough to grind results. The weak seam is well known to both sides' escort radius. When fighters must turn back, bomber boxes cross the last stretch alone. That is where the intercept script has lived since 1943. Hold fighters just outside the escort edge. Drop in from the sun, make one violent cut, reform, repeat. Crews can recite it by muscle memory. February's concentrated strikes crack open the season. Those raids don't end the problem, they set conditions. Airfields are watched, flak belts mapped, rendezvous altitudes rehearsed. More important, a different escort plan starts to appear on boards: time blocks of cover instead of one stretch. P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds carry the stream part way. P-51B. C units arrive late with drop tanks, then jettison and fight clean near the objective. On paper, that looks like a range line moving east. In the cockpit, it feels like this: when one section hands off another, shows up with full tanks and fresh oxygen, and the empty lane you used to exploit never quite opens. German confidence in early March is not chest thumping, it is a practiced tempo. Controllers know the climb lanes. Staffel leaders know where the bomber stream bends to the IP and where a front quarter cut will snap a formation. Veterans teach new pilots that the escorts will thin near the end. If you wait, you choose the merge. If you misjudge, fuel kills you. Even with losses mounting, this rhythm still promises control until the day single-engine escorts stay deep. For the American side, the stakes are arithmetic and human. Without cover over the target, top turrets and waist guns live on seconds of tracer and prayer. A bad minute can erase an entire element. Crew fatigue accumulates in ways that do not show on maps: hands that shake while loading belts, a gunner who counts parachutes instead of fighters. If deep escort is a one-off stunt, the system reverts to attrition the force cannot accept. If it becomes routine, bomber commanders can schedule raids by procedure instead of hope. Every decision flows from that hinge. The March Berlin plan is built to enforce routine. Tankers fill metal in the dark. Ground crews safety wire caps with hands that have done this 100 times. Briefings allocate fuel minutes by phase climb, cruise escort, combat allowance return. The new instruction under Doolittle is not poetry. It is permission, range ahead, strike assembly points, re-enter, at altitude hunt. That changes what a German pilot sees when he rolls into the pass. Instead of a dwindling picket tied to the bombers, he meets fresh sections arriving on schedule, tanks gone RPM at the top of green, ready to stay after the first turn. Operational pressure tightens on the defenders. Fuel is rationed. Serviceability is a question before weather. Veterans carry most of the fight. Everyone lost takes months of experience with him. To avoid flak alignment, attackers vary altitudes and headings. To avoid escort defenders, try to time the lane between handoffs. That lane shrinks as the plan layers coverage. The risk flips longer chases. Burn the very fuel needed to climb for a second pass, while Mustangs with clean wings can convert surplus speed into a vertical re-entry that was not present over central Germany a season earlier. Why this episode matters beyond a single morning is not a slogan, it is a behavior change forced at scale. If escorts can be over Berlin every time the schedule says so, the intercept script breaks where it is most profitable for the defender. Controllers cannot promise weight past the edge. Staffel leaders cannot tell rookies the gap opens near the target. Bomber crews feel the difference in their chests the moment after bombs off is no longer the loneliest minute of the war. And the next mission planner can allocate losses with a pencil instead of a guess. Hold the focus there. This is not about a perfect airplane beating a perfect opponent. It is about a system aligning airframe, fuel tanks and orders so that one fact becomes normal escorts reach Berlin and remain combat credible in the target zone. If that fact holds for March and repeats in the week that follows, the defender must either fight on worse terms or let the stream pass unmolested. Either choice serves the same end for the attacker repetition. The title's claim is not thunder, it is procedure. German pilots meet Mustangs where they expected empty sky, and the math that kept them safe no longer balances. That is why the window matters, and why the outcome of the morning extends past the contrails of a single day. Before deep escort, the threat geometry is simple. BF, 109 seconds, and FW 190 seconds, wait high just beyond the point where previous escorts have always turned back. They pick a front quarter cut, dive slightly out of the sun, short burst aim to saw a hole in the lead elements, then pass through and climb back to reset. To the man in a bomber turret, this does not look like fighters versus fighters. It feels like hammer blows arriving on a schedule, black seeds in the wind that grow into tracers too late to dodge. A top turret gunner reads it in the body. The mount shudders, armor glass thrums, the smell of burned cordite crawls into the mask. Even when return fire is good, the interceptor's energy state usually lets him leave the cone of guns in one piece and try again. The Luftwaffe pilot's side of that same moment is routine. From altitude, he watches a long white bomber stream soaring the sky, counts escort specs, and most days sees what he expects, fighters thinning as fuel time erodes. Throttle is forward but not jammed. Mixture and prop are set for the dive. The sight ring walks a shallow lead as he commits to the pass. The plan's strength is not brute speed. It is timing attack when the escorts are fewest, and tied to the bombers then climb out on schedule. If he misjudges, fuel punishes first. If he is right, he decides the merge. What changes in early March 1944 is not a new trick in isolation. It is presence in the exact window where the script used to pay. The P-51B, C with the Merlin under the cowl and external tanks under the wings can ride shotgun that far and still have a fight left. In a cockpit, this translates to tactile differences that matter at altitude. With tanks on the Mustang, carries the stream east on long legs. After jettison, the wings feel immediately cleaner. The small shiver disappears when the pylons go light. The RPM band climbs with less throttle, and the airplane will hold a sustained turn or a quick vertical pull that earlier escorts could not always afford over central Germany. The numbers live in the pilot's habits more than on a placard. At cruise, the manifold needle sits steady in the green mixture, leaned as far as the engine will tolerate in the thin cold. You save fuel minutes because those minutes buy presence near the objective. Approaching the target belt, a section lead checks oxygen. Hiss taps the drop tank switches, watches them tumble, then calls a short flat tanks away. The wind changes pitch. Acceleration comes not as a surge, but as a clean willingness to keep climbing when you bank back toward the contrails. Now combat power prop forward, throttle to the stop for a short burst if needed, eyes outside. The airplane will still be there after the first turn. Range is only half the mechanism. Energy management is the other. A 109 or 190, committing to the classical pass, now finds that the one slash and out must account for a defender that can re-enter from above or behind, without first having to choose between chasing and fuel survival. A P-51 that arrives with tanks on can afford to be a picket. A P-51 that has just jettisoned can turn that picket into a predator. In practice, that means a German pilot rolling into the merge discovers a second problem. Even if he survives the guns and clears the bomber's cone, he may spend his energy escaping a Mustang, still fast in the climb. The window to reset is narrower. The choice to chase is costlier. From the bomber's perspective, escort behavior is the evidence. Before there was a moment when the sky around the formation thinned, friendly fighters visibly turned for fuel, leaving a sense of exposure that every waist gunner learned to taste. In March, that sensation blurs. A P-47 flight hands off to another cover. New silhouettes appear at the right time. P-51 seconds among them, and the old empty lane the gunners dreaded never opens into a full gap. After bombs away, the minute that used to feel like the loneliest in the war isn't as long. The interphone chatter stays clipped and practical instead of tightening into the hard silence that means the next pass is coming with no help near. Inside the German formations, the shift reads as broken range math. Staffel leaders still set up the cut, still count on escorts tied tightly to their bombers, still bank toward what should be the safe arc outside escort cover, only to find pairs of Mustangs sliding down the rear quarter or another pair. Lifting the nose across the canopy bow at the exact moment, habit says the lane is clear. The feeling is not that the enemy flies a miracle machine, it is that the pattern has failed. The pass is not wrong in technique, it is wrong in timing because the defender can now stay. Survivability in this band is made of small cockpit choices. How long you hold WEP before the coolant needle creeps, whether you pull into the vertical when your gut says no, how cleanly you coordinate rudder when you roll into a high G. Reversal in thin air. The Mustang's deep chin intake is not a brochure note. It is the place where the wind noise changes when you pitch up. It is the cue that you can keep the sight picture stable just long enough to make the short burst count. On the German side, a 190 driver feels the controls tighten. In the thin cold, hears the tone of his engine harden, and knows that if the first pass does not buy space, the second will cost too much altitude or fuel against a fighter that still has climb in hand. Gunnery is similarly practical. Nobody in this fight thinks in muzzle velocities first. They think in lead how much to walk the pipper ahead of a target that is about to cross your nose once and vanish. Bomber crews learn aim points on 109 seconds and 190 seconds by silhouette and habit. Fighter pilots learn where the bomber stream throws contrail shadows that hide or reveal an attacker at the last moment. A P-51 section that has just cleaned its wings can hold a longer tracking shot in a climbing turn than a heavier, draggier airframe. In the headset, that becomes two calm words. Continue. Continue, instead of the old break-off dictated by fuel margins. Temperature and altitude matter because they write the limits on the needles. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin and brittle. Oxygen hisses steady. The canopy bows frost at edges. The smallest slip in trim makes the sight ring wander. A machine that will sit hands-off stable long enough to fire a short, disciplined burst gives its pilot time to think one step ahead. The Merlin's high-altitude torque band is experienced not as a statistic, but as forgiveness, a little more pull available after you expected the climb to die. That forgiveness is what turns a handoff between escort blocks into a net instead of a thin rope. Somebody is always in position to take the next stab. None of this makes the bomber stream invulnerable. Flak still walks through the boxes. A well-timed front quarter shot from an experienced 109 or a 190 with heavy cannon can still snap a fortress open in a second. But the profitable window for doing it, the stretch near the target where escorts used to be thin, now contains fighters that are not leaving. And that forces different choices. A German pilot who stays to press the second pass risks getting caught slow and low, with no fuel margin to climb back to safety. One who breaks off early preserves his machine and crew but leaves the stream more intact than doctrine assumes. The P-51's visibility and handling are small but real multipliers in this environment. The bubble canopy does not erase blind spots, but the forward quarter and the roll rate together let a lead see two problems at once: the threat diving at his bombers and the partner he needs to cover while he engages it. The section works by short calls: left pair high tanks away, you're 6, not speeches. The airplane's stability lets those words arrive with action, not with the lag of fighting the machine first. Over the target, that is the difference between an intercept that looks neat on a board and a presence that an opponent cannot time around. In sum, the why behind the shock in the opening minute is not a mystical leap in performance. It is the day when range climb clean wing and orders align so that a single-engine escort still has the energy and fuel minutes to fight after the point where opponents expected an empty sky. To the bomber crews, that registers as the first merge where escorts do not thin. To the German pilots, it registers as a pattern that no longer pays a pass that used to buy room, now buying a tail full of Mustang. The technology is felt in small cockpit truths: a steadier sight, a needle that will hold at the top of green a little longer, a vertical pull that does not stall out, and a radio that stays quiet because the correction you meant to call has already gone stale. He rides the climb lane because the controller's tone made it sound routine. Throttle forward prop set mixture leaned until the engine note turns dry and even. Berlin sits somewhere under the haze layer. Above it, the contrails stitch their white ladders. He knows where the stream bends. He has flown this geometry for months. The headset is clean except for a brief, flat call, front quarter once. He acknowledges with a double click and trims a touch of right rudder. The sight ring carries the lead box just off center. The sun sits where it should for a shallow slash. He is not tense. He is measuring. Air thins. The stick grows heavier in the hand. Oxygen hisses into the mask and freezes the top lip. Manifold needle kisses the top of the green band. The engine's vibration comes up through boot soles as a fine buzz. A wingman slides into place half a span low, exactly where habit says he should be. The pass is timed to the minute when escorts used to thin. He can feel that minute even without a clock. The sky around bombers always looks a little emptier then, like a street after the buses have gone. He commits. Nose down speed gathers the pipper, walks across the lead element. The first burst is a short line of light, more to fix the sight than to kill. Off the left, a 190 dives into the cut with a confidence that has a body temperature. It is going to be one pass and out a clean arc back to where fuel is safe and air is thick. A new silhouette materializes out of a contrail seam and refuses to be background. Deep chin scoop, clean wing. He puts it out of mind because the habit says escorts tie themselves to bombers near the target, and that means they will break off to keep station. He presses his pass. The bombers flash past. A top turret clatters. The formation shudders in his windscreen. He is already thinking about the climb when the escort does not go away. The Mustang throws off its tanks. He does not see the jettison. He hears the wind change pitch and registers the way the other airplane's nose keeps coming up as if the air were thicker than it is. He banks into the climb-out he has practiced since 1943, feels the controls stiffen, waits for the emptiness the escorts leave when they turn. It does not open. Two shapes rise across his nose. A third drops through his high six and slides into a place where the old pattern never put anyone. He reaches for the radio to call a correction, hold higher or turn earlier, some small change that would preserve the pattern, and stops. The headset carries a voice that is breathing too fast, a clipped fuel state that dies before the answer. He keeps the nose up another second and feels the altitude deplete like water from a cup with a crack. The choice is the same as always. Stay for a second pass and pay for it with height and fuel, or break off early and preserve the machine and the crew, but the cost curve has moved. He levels earlier than pride wants him to, and the Mustang still shows up on the canopy bow, not fast in a straight line so much as wrong in timing present where the math said empty. He shoves the throttle and pulls just enough to keep the air attached. The engine note hardens, the frame hums, the sight ring is no longer a weapon, but a reference for escape. He glances at the coolant needle. It sits where it should, but feels like judgment. The radio throws another short call. Left pair high, and he sees a section of escorts cross the bomber stream at a height that used to be untouched by single-engine fighters this deep. He turns for the arc he still thinks of as safe, and sees with a calm that surprises him that the arc is filled. He does not speak for 3 breaths. Inside the helmet, it is only air noise and the rasp of oxygen. When he finally says, "reform," his own voice sounds like it came from outside the airplane. He looks for his wingman and finds him a few spans low, lifting the nose as if trying to write a new diagram into the sky by force. They will climb where they can and see if the controller offers another vector that still makes sense. He keeps one eye on a pair of Mustangs that are not even chasing, just holding altitude, with the relaxed confidence of airplanes that have paid the fuel bill already. A few thousand feet below, in the right seat of a bomber cockpit, the day is counted in small mercies. The pilot's gloves stick and unstick from the yoke. The engineer reads needles aloud in a voice balanced between boredom and prayer. The interphone is busy the way a shop is busy, short calls that move parts instead of opinions. A month ago there was a minute when the air around the formation thinned and everything felt louder, waist guns alone with their rhythm, a top turret gunner trying to keep the sight smooth, as tracers wrote crooked ropes across the side. The minute after bombs away was the worst. There was a low physical loneliness that made the tongue taste metal. Today, that minute is different, in a way that does not need an intelligence officer to explain it. As one flight of escorts peels away, another is already present higher and clean wings bare where tanks had been. The pilot sees them as shapes. First, no need to name the type, to know what matters they point outward, not inward. They are looking for something that is not a bomber cockpit. The interphone keeps its ordinary pace. Right, waist clear. Tail too low. Roger. The anxiety that climbs into the headset when help leaves does not climb. The airplane still shakes under flak bursts, and a box 300 yards off the left wing loses altitude in a way no fighter can fix, but the sense of being timed by someone else's schedule eases. He finds himself checking time to rally instead of counting how many shapes are closing. From a Mustang cockpit, the difference is procedure, not glory. The brief says the same things it always says: altitude, headings, egress plan, then adds permission that used to be withheld. Range ahead, hit assembly points, re-enter hot if able. He lifts from a wet runway while it is still dark and spends an hour being a small part of a long, orderly line. The airplane sits on its tanks like a horse leaning into a hill. Mixture is set to lean enough that the engine grumbles if you ask for too much. The canopy latches with a clack he can feel in his elbows. He spends more mental energy on fuel than on fear. Near the belt, his section lead calls tanks and they go. The sound the wind makes changes. The airplane quits feeling like it wants to sag sideways when you roll. He checks the needles because habit demands it manifold steady RPM, where it should be at this height coolant fine. The horizon looks less like a thing to protect and more like a surface you can dive under and pop through. They cross above the stream on a line that used to be handled by airplanes with shorter legs, and he marks the moment when he knows they will still be here after the first turn. It is not a thrill. It is a subtraction, one worry removed from a list. The first contact is a pair that commits honestly a clean front quarter/guns blinking no waste. He rolls to put his own lead where it must go, and feels the sight picture hold instead of slide. The airplane seems to forgive a tiny mistake in rudder. The nose stays where he wants it for the tick of a second, longer than the brain expects at this altitude. He presses the trigger for a snap of fire and releases without thinking about it. He does not count hits. He counts options. There are still some left. A voice on the radio says continue, in a tone that does not rise. He continues. Another section crosses above them at an angle that fills a part of the sky that used to be a gap. He is aware of the bomber stream, the way a man on a roof is aware of the ground as a constant that can hurt him if he ignores it. Not as the focus of the job, the airplane remains honest when he asks for a short climb, and he recognizes the permission that comes with that honesty. You can stay a few seconds longer. You can be the problem and not just the picket. He does not chase into flak. Nobody reminds him not to. The plan is explicit. He checks 6 with a tilt that makes the sun line over the canopy bow. The horizon wobbles for a breath when a burst goes off close enough to sound like someone hitting sheet metal with a hammer. He thinks of fuel again, and is surprised by the number his brain gives him back enough to be here, enough to leave without guessing. A pair of 109 seconds tries a second pass and breaks it off, earlier than the stick position suggests they wanted to. He feels the rhythm change in his stomach before he sees it with his eyes. When the section lead says range, the word lands, like an everyday verb. The human part is not triumph. It is relief shaped like routine. The bomber crew keeps its checklist cadence after bombs off. The escort flights trade places without the thin emptiness that used to stretch between them. The defenders still fight hard, and when they hit something, it breaks in a way that fills a man's mouth with the taste of hot metal and carbon. But the moment when the old script paid where a second pass could be bought at the price of altitude because no one was left to interfere, shrinks until it cannot be found by feel. On the way out, he watches sunlight drag gold across a torn overcast and thinks of nothing clever. He runs the fuel math again, not because he doubts it, but because it is what he has practiced. The radio crackles short phrases with the indifference of a tool being used correctly. The airplane hums exactly the way it should. Somewhere behind a bomber stream that should have been naked over the target is not. Somewhere ahead, a controller who expected to harvest when the escorts turned finds the field too crowded to time. He does not put those thoughts into words. He just trims a hair of right rudder, slides a palm over the throttle to feel if it is really where he left it, and listens to the oxygen hiss that means he is still inside the machine that will take him home. The change begins on a blackboard, not in a dogfight. Route lines, time blocks, and fuel minutes are laid out the way a railroad sets timetables. The 8th Air Force Mission Cell treats the bomber stream as a moving city that must be guarded from takeoff to egress. That requires layered cover rather than one continuous escort that inevitably thins at the end. The plan assigns altitude bands and clock windows early and mid-route pickets. Often P-38 seconds, P-47 seconds, carry the column to a handoff, P-51B. C groups with external tanks meet the stream nearer the objective jettison and fight clean over the target. On the chart, the handoffs look like knots along a rope. In the air, they feel like a net. As one flight peels, another arrives. So the empty lane German pilots timed for months fails to open. This is a doctrine shift as much as a logistic one. Under new guidance, escorts are authorized to range ahead, attack assembly points, and pursue beyond the bombers when the opportunity will break the intercept cycle. The old restrictions stick close orbit the box's protected optics but ceded initiative. The new procedure is minimalist tanks away range re-enter. It turns the escort from a fence into a hunter that meets interceptors before they shape the merge, then reappears after the first pass to deny the reset. Radio traffic stays functional range continue high pair, because the real work is a schedule the enemy cannot time. Schedules live or die on fuel. Every escort brief in early 1944 reads like a ledger climb allowance, cruise burn, combat burn bingo. The P-51's trick is not just economy, it is sequencing. Drop tanks by the ride east without stealing the fight. With tanks on a section can sit in the dull part of the mission, long legs, low power, without touching the internal reserve that pays for altitude and turns near the target. When the lead calls tanks, the wings go clean, manifold stays at the top of green with less throttle, and the fighter has both climb and time left, precisely where previous escorts ran out of one or both. What the Luftwaffe experiences is not a new statistic, it is a new presence in the one window that used to belong to them. Presence at scale requires a supply chain that keeps its promises. You cannot plan deep escort on paper unless depots deliver airworthy airframes, engines, tires and paper, fabric tanks in numbers that absorb daily attrition. The American system's advantage is not that no airplane breaks, it's that broken airplanes do not break the plan. Spare engines are pulled at the field and replaced at the depot without pausing the squadron's slot on tomorrow's board. Tanks arrive by the crate. Plumbing and sway braces become mundane work for ground crews who can fit them in the dark. When a group loses a handful of fighters to weather or mechanicals, the time block still appears over the bomber stream because another squadron fills the hole. To a German pilot hunting for the seam, that redundancy looks like stubborn luck. It is logistics. On the German side, the plan is as old as the interceptors hold high cover outside escort range. Commit once in a clean front quarter slash, then reform for a second pass where guns and fuel still favor you. The method works when escorts thin as a function of fuel rather than of design. It falters against a schedule designed to be thickest, where the defenders expect it thinnest. Add to that the practical constraints in early 1944, fuel rationing airfield repairs, and a pilot pipeline that now replaces veterans with men who have fewer hours under the same weather. None of this erases German skill, it narrows options. When a veteran Staffel tries to time the second pass and finds fresh Mustangs at altitude instead of the emptiness memory, promised tactics that rely on choosing the merge degrade into hurried shots and longer, riskier chases. Doctrine reinforces the imbalance. American escorts are told to hit assembly and reform areas and to stay on if fuel allows. That means some of the fight occurs before the classic merge, at the very places where the Luftwaffe builds its mass and confidence. German controllers must now choose between launching earlier, spending fuel before contact, or later arriving piecemeal into a sky already patrolled. Either way, the intercept takes place under worse math. Even when a pass lands and a bomber falls smoking, the reset is contested by escorts with clean wings and enough internal fuel to climb back for the next angle. The one pass and out script turns into one pass and decide, and every minute spent deciding is burned altitude and range. Industrial tempo makes doctrine durable. The 8th Air Force is not counting on a single spectacular mission, it is building repetition. That repetition consumes materiel, airframes, engines, drop tanks, oxygen bottles, spark plugs, parachutes in volumes that only a broad manufacturing base can replace without hiccup. The material detail sounds small until it breaks the plan. A run of bad magnetos, a shortage in oxygen regulators, a missing crate of tank fittings. In a system tuned for daily sorties, these are not anecdotes. They are failure modes, preempted by inventory buffers and depot throughput. On the Luftwaffe side, even where factories still deliver airframes, fuel and experienced labor limit sorties, a trained line chief or an instrument tech takes time to grow and is not easily replaced after a raid. A fighter that returns hold might fly tomorrow in one system and sit for days in another. Command decisions tie the chain together. Authorizing free hunt is only useful if group and squadron leaders are trusted to exercise it without losing the bombers. That trust is built by briefing discipline, altitude gates, egress headings, no-go lines and debrief exploitation. What assembly point was hit, what time block ran thin, what fuel plan proved tight. Intelligence feeds are practical photographs of airfields and staging corners along the approach belts, flak concentrations plotted so escorts know where not to chase a kill. The result is a playbook that can be executed by different units on different days and still put Mustangs over Berlin often enough that the enemy stops betting against it. Weather and navigation, usually footnotes, become primary actors at this depth. Winds aloft shift the bomber stream's timing. Contrails form bands that can hide or expose. A plan that only works under perfect skies is not a plan. It is a wish. Deep escorts function. Because the timing blocks have slack, if a front moves faster, the handoff isn't a cliff edge. A P-51 section with tanks still on can loiter 10 more minutes to catch a late stream. A section with tanks off can range ahead and then accept a leaner egress if weather shortens the fight. The procedural flexibility is the true range extender, less visible than a map line, crucial in practice. Attrition accounting hardens the advantage. In the Berlin window, the Luftwaffe still lands, hits, and the 8th Air Force still pays. But the shape of loss changes. Veteran German pilots increasingly trade away fuel and height, trying to secure a second pass that escorts now dispute. Some never make the numbers back to home field. Others survive but are marched by maintenance, fuel, and fatigue into a lower sortie rate. On the American side, the escort force rotates groups to keep the time blocks fat even after a bad day. Neither side is immune to depletion. One side's process is built to eat it and print another schedule tomorrow. All of this loops back to the title's promise. The phrase "escorts reached Berlin" is not a boast. It is a procedural guarantee made possible by doctrine, fuel, parts, and orders. The German pilot's panic is not cartoon fear. It is the quiet realization that the old reference points the minute when escorts thin, the angle that buys a clean escape, the empty lane after the turn, no longer match the sky. When that mismatch repeats across multiple missions in March, it becomes a systemic break. Controllers cannot reliably mass fighters outside a safe radius that no longer exists. Staffel leaders cannot coach rookies to wait for a gap that doesn't open. There is also a downstream effect that never looks dramatic on film planning freedom. Once deep escort is routine bomber, targeteers can mix routes and altitudes without praying for a weather coincidence to bridge an escort gap. Fighter planners can allocate spares and late launches to fatten thin spots because they know fuel support and tanks will be there. Those choices do not make headlines. They compound into a season where the defender fights on a schedule written by someone else. Finally, doctrine becomes culture. Crews who have flown 3 Berlin range missions under fighter cover brief differently than crews who hope the escort will stretch. They accept bomb-run discipline under fire because someone will still be there in the turn. They recover faster from contact because handoff flights arrive when the board said they would. On the other side, formations that once dove into the bomber stream with the casual boldness of a familiar harvest start checking 6 on the egress of their first pass. That glance is the collapse in miniature. It costs a second. In this air, a second is altitude, fuel, or both. No single gadget or hero does this. The Merlin P-51 with tanks is the tool. The system orders, blocks depots, fuel weather margins, debrief loops is the reason the tool shows up on time. That is why the morning over Berlin reads the way it does. From inside a German headset, the plan he trained to exploit still looks elegant on paper, but when he reaches for the lane that should be empty, his hand closes on air. The rest panic-broken radio calls, the long oxygen hiss that stands in for words, is human behavior doing math. It once trusted, and finding the answer has changed. They had a name for the empty minute, and it lived in muscle more than in briefings. You waited for the escorts to thin, you counted contrails, you timed the bend to the IP, and you took the first slash when the sky around the bombers went light. That was the defender's comfort choice. Pick the pass, pick the angle, pick the moment to leave. When the choice vanished, it did not go with a bang. It drained away through a dozen small facts no one could ignore. The first fact was presence. Not rumours, not a one-off, but single-engine escorts still over the city wings bare where tanks had been after the merge. That alone shifted every calculation downstream. Controllers who used to hold formations high, then release them into a thinning picket, now watched their boards fill with reports of cover already in the target box. Staffel leaders who had taught rookies to wait for the gap began to cut them in earlier burning fuel they needed for the second pass, because delaying meant arriving into a sky that did not open. The second fact was timing inversion. The profit used to be near the target, one disciplined front quarter cut to break a lead element, a second pass if fuel and height allowed, then egress. With escorts layered on time blocks, the most favourable minute no longer sat at the end. Pairs of Mustangs entered the picture, not as rescuers flailing to keep up with the bombers, but as hunters already at altitude, already trimmed for a short vertical pull in thin air. The defender's rhythm commit, reset, commit became commit, decide. Every decision cost, altitude or range. The window for a second pass shrank until it required a bet that felt reckless even to veterans. The third fact was behavioral bleed. A formation that once rolled into the merge with the easy confidence of a harvest began checking 6 during the first egress. That glance is not theatrics. It is the moment when experience admits the old map is wrong. A pilot who cedes 1 second to that check gives away the very energy that used to buy his reset. Multiply that second across a staffel, across a week of missions, and the culture changes. The first pass looks shorter, the second pass rarer, the chase after the bomb run more tentative, because fuel math now punishes zeal. For the bomber crews, the break is quieter but as final. The loneliest minute after bombs off before the turn had been a physical thing, a hush in the interphone, a tightening in the throat, a superstitious habit of counting shapes closing. In March, the minute still hurts, but it no longer feels like abandonment. Escorts arrive as others leave. The guns keep their cadence. The pilot reads his engine as a machine to manage, rather than as the last object between the crew and a hole in the wing. Nothing about flak softens. Nothing about German gunnery grows kind. What disappears is the certainty that the defender owns the clock. Inside German operations rooms, The language shifts from where to when, in a way that gives up ground. Where to mass is tactical, when massing pays is strategic. Once escorts become routine in the deep box where you meet the stream matters less than when you are forced to fight it. The Luftwaffe can still climb fast, still hit hard, still kill. What it cannot do with the same freedom is choose the second half of the fight. That is the inflection initiative leaking from the defender to the timetable in the attacker's pocket. There is a sentence people like to repeat about the moment Mustangs appeared over Berlin. Whether it was said exactly that way at that exact time matters less here than the hard record that explains why anyone would say it at all. Range joined to energy, under orders that freed it, carried out often enough that even a good intercept plan met stamina instead of luck. The collapse is not an insult to German skill. It is a verdict on a script that assumed the sky would be empty at the profit point. Look at the small seams where habit tears. A veteran expects to roll into the vertical after his pass, collect his wingman, and turn back through a corridor he has flown 100 times. He meets a pair, already coasting along that corridor, noses just above the horizon, not chasing, merely waiting with the kind of patience that comes from fuel minutes in hand. He can force a second pass, but it will be shallower than doctrine wants and drawn out over longer time inside escort reach. He can break off early and live, but the choice concedes the stream. Neither outcome nourishes the belief that waiting beyond escort radius still pays. The maintenance ramp tells a similar story without words. Airframes that used to cycle fast enough for 2 sorties before fatigue crews gave out now limp to the line short on fuel, pilots bone-tired from longer chases that end with an empty tank and no claim. A hole in a wing route that would once be patched by noon sits until evening because the line chief cannot magic fuel or hands. None of this looks like a battlefield moment. All of it sounds like surrender when written into sortie rates. The debriefs on the American side stay clipped and procedural, which is the point. Tanks away at, range to, contact at. The absence of excitement is evidence of the break. Deep escort is normal enough to be boring in the telling. The same boredom works on the other side as a solvent. Rookies learn that the lane their instructors promised is unreliable. Instructors stop promising it. Controllers start hedging launches with more and earlier vectors that erode the very fuel cushion the plan depended on. By the time the habit of waiting has died, no one holds a funeral for it. The proof is behavior. Fewer second passes, shorter first passes. More attention to fuel on egress than to the next angle of attack. More formations that hover outside the stream, hoping for a thinning that does not come until the bombers are already turning home under cover. When the old script does land, when a front quarter cut hits hard and a fortress goes orange, the triumph is tempered by the knowledge that the reset will be contested and the chasers will pay. Victory that cannot be repeated on schedule is not doctrine. It is an exception. So the line breaks here. Wait beyond escort radius. Harvest near the target. That line was a promise that held the morale of defenders and the nerves of attackers. In the late winter sky, it stops matching the world. The myth does not die in a speech. It dies in a pilot's hand pausing over the radio because the correction he meant to call turn earlier, hold higher, has lost its use. It dies in the oxygen hiss that fills the silence after a name does not answer. It dies when a Mustang holds a little climb after it should have sagged, and when a controller staring at a board that used to predict emptiness starts to pencil in escorts present as a default. From that point forward, the fight is still deadly, but it is no longer the defender's choice. And in this war, as in any other, the side that writes the schedule takes pieces of the outcome before the first engine starts. The film of this moment does not live in a single reel. It lives in schedules. After early March, planners begin to treat deep escort as an assumption, not a gamble. Mission boards that once circled the last 100 miles in pencil now mark them in ink. The change shows up in small, unglamorous paperwork fuel tables that allocate combat minutes over the target as standard. Maintenance slips that note tank plumbing as routine. Debrief forms that log range ahead as often as orbit cover. When a system turns a stunt into procedure, the enemy must either adapt at once or pay by the day. Luftwaffe behavior records the payment. Units still climb, still cut, still hit, but the second pass becomes unusual, and the long chase rarer not because courage thins, but because math does. Controllers tasked with holding fighters just outside the escort edge discover the edge has moved to the city. Staffel leaders who once briefed a clean egress corridor find pairs waiting in the corridor itself. Even on days when losses hurt, the 8th Air Force escorts reappear 2 mornings later in the same airspace with the same permission to range. Predictability, once the defender's friend turns against him. If escorts come when the plan says they will, every intercept that depends on their absence is a bad bet. The bomber force absorbs the change as a mental reset more than a metric. Crews still take flak, formations still lose ships, a man can still die in a sky bright as glass. Yet the loneliest minute of the mission, the mic-tight pause after bombs off before the turn stops feeling like a ritual of abandonment. The interphone keeps its ordinary rhythm. Tail too low. Clear. The pilot flies his needles instead of his nerves. The sense that the enemy owns the clock around the target fades. That is not immunity. It is relief shaped into discipline. Doctrine hardens into muscle. Doolittle's permission to range ahead and re-enter is no longer a novelty to be tested. It is a standing order whose results compound. Escorts strike at assembly points and reappear after the merge, forcing interceptors to choose between chasing into flak and conserving fuel. That choice echoes on the ground. Veteran pilots who stretch a second pass burn minutes they cannot buy back. Machines that return hold wait for parts longer than plans allow. A few months earlier, a clean first pass plus a second could seem routine. By late spring, pressing for that second feels like gambling wages the unit cannot afford. Planning freedom is the quiet legacy. Targeteers begin to mix altitudes and routes, with less fear of leaving gaps. Fighter controllers stack time blocks with spares and late launches. When weather shifts, a section with tanks on can hold 10 extra minutes and still arrive clean. None of this wins a headline. All of it produces the kind of reliability that grinds. The runway picture matches the board crates of paper tanks opened before dawn. Ground crews who plumb lines by touch, pilots who brief fuel in minutes the way a surgeon counts instruments. Repetition is not spectacle, it is pressure. On the German side, the reaction is pragmatic and unsentimental. Some units launch earlier to meet the stream farther out, paying fuel up front. Others hold back and arrive piecemeal into a sky already patrolled. Training pipelines shorten by necessity. Experience concentrates in fewer men who must fly more often. Fatigue starts to write itself into sortie rates. There is no moment when someone declares the old intercept script dead. There are only more debriefs that read first pass, only more controllers who hedge vectors, more leaders who accept that waiting for the escorts to thin near the target is hope, not plan. The public memory tends to compress this to a quote about Mustangs over Berlin. Whether anyone said it in those words on that day is less important than the record that sustains the sentiment. Escorts reached the deep box, often enough to be expected there. Once expected, they shape decisions before engines start. An opponent who cannot count on a gap loses leverage not in a duel, but in a week's worth of timetables. What carries forward is not a myth of invincibility, but a habit of design. Range is treated as an operational tool, not an attribute. Orders are drafted to exploit it. Logistics are tuned to guarantee it. The airframe is the visible part. The system is the reason the visible part arrives on time. That logic will migrate. You can see it in how return legs grow teeth, rail lines interdicted, airfields strafed under strict constraints, assembly corners watched. Escorts cease to be a fence around the bombers and become a schedule that squeezes the defender's options from climb to egress. 2 questions sit naturally at the end of this window and belong in the comments, not as bait but as work. If deep escort at this scale had appeared 6 months earlier, do the defender's pilot and fuel curves cross in a different place by winter? When an interceptor is superb in a single pass, but cannot repeat on schedule, how much of its excellence survives? Contact with a system built for repetition, the chain ahead is simple to follow and worth staying for. From the deep box we step down the ladder, how permission to range turns into routine strikes on rail and runway, how timing blocks shape the egress fight. How the same logic of presence on schedule erodes confidence under the overcast at home. The tone does not change. No speeches, no trumpets, just the record of a timetable that kept being met until the opponent stopped betting against it.